Hi, I'm Mark Bailey. Welcome back to the Meetings Club channel. Now, it's just over a year since the EU General Data Protection Regulation, or GDPR as it's known, came into force. But just when you might have thought all things GDPR were now smoothly up and running, there's now a whole new concern on the horizon linked to Brexit. This could mean that there will be not one, but two GDPRs with implications for many organisations. Arvi Virdee is a director of Smartec, a specialist in technology and data solutions for the meetings and event sector, and an expert in GDPR process and systems. But before we got onto the thorny subject of Brexit, I asked Arvi what impact GDPR has had on event organisers since its introduction a year ago.
In answer to your question, very significant, given that the events industry is famous for dealing with large volumes of personal data. We all know what I call the event supply chain, where you've got the event owner, which is often a corporate or an association, working with an agency, working with hotels, working with other third parties, all exchanging data between them. So there is a lot of personal data, and a lot of companies have really had to really understand that and the flow of data to really get their heads around GDPR. And just to quote a very recent survey by Events Force, they said 90% of respondents to their survey had been impacted by GDPR. In other words, it had a significant impact on people's daily work.
So what have been the biggest challenges, do you think, that businesses have faced?
I think the biggest challenges have been just understanding the breadth of the legislation and the new language it has thrown up. For example, legitimate interest and consent and controllers and processes. These seem like technical terms, but they're actually designed for lay people. And of course, lay people are not familiar with those terms. So it's been a real a process of understanding and a journey of understanding exactly what those terms mean to each business and applying those terms to the business. So that's been one of the biggest challenges. Initially, organizations had to go through a data audit. And that is really understanding all your data, and that is often the place to start, by carrying out a full data audit, understand your data, what you're doing with it, where it came from, and then applying the principles of GDPR.
So what would you say, Arvi, are some of the most common mistakes which are still being made by people?
I would say there is still, I mentioned earlier about consent and legitimate interest. One of the most common mistakes, even at the time and even now, is understanding whether you can use that contact list, which you've had for several months, several years, and worrying whether you need a consent first. What happened a year ago, actually, when GDPR came out, was a lot of people sent what's called re-consent messages to their contact list. In other words, asking people to consent to be contacted after GDPR when they didn't have to, because they already had a legitimate interest to contact those people. So it is quite a grey area. A lot of people finding it difficult to get their head around it, but that's one of the big areas which people are still struggling with. And another one is sending and receiving those personal data lists, which I mentioned, invitation lists, delegate lists, etc., without encryption. So they should all be encrypted. Many organizations don't understand that their Outlook or their Gmail is not encrypted by standard. So that's something which mistakes are still ongoing now.
So has anybody fallen foul of the legislation so far? Has anybody been fined?
There've been one or two of the big organizations. Google was fined 50 million euros by the French supervisory authorities. But those terms and those figures don't really apply to most of us in the real world. And of course, Google has enough lawyers to be able to fight its corner. The truth is that it takes time for investigations to take place. And there are limited resources at the ICO, who are our supervisory authority. So in terms of significant within our industry, I can't think of anything which has come through, although there are one or two which are in the pipeline. I think British Airways had a data breach last year in September, but again, that's probably still being investigated.
I guess, therefore, it'll be interesting to see actually what happens, and people will be waiting to see what's happened, because it's obviously a very important area to get right. But I guess just as we thought everything was beginning to calm down from a GDPR point of view, Brexit has reared its head, and you believe that there are some, or potentially some, serious ramifications with Brexit. In what way, Arvi?
Yeah, so this is an emerging topic, let's put it like that, as Brexit has been emerging for a period of time. There are two very significant changes which is going to have which are going to have an impact on business. Firstly, when the UK leaves the EU, the UK will no longer be part of the club, right, the EU club. So it'll actually be considered what's called a third country. Again, I don't want to get technical at all, but in effect, as far as the EU and EU data protection is concerned, the UK will be treated similarly to China or India, in the sense that the exchange of data between the EU and the UK would require something called a contract, okay? Similar to if you were shipping your data over to another third country like China or India. Okay, so absolutely the first implication is that the UK will no longer be part of the club, and exchanging data is going to be significant, which of course for the events industry is very significant given the global nature of the events industry. The other significant change is that rather than having one GDPR, there will in effect be two different GDPRs. One is the existing one for European data and European citizens' data, but also the UK will create its own version of GDPR, which looks after or looks at the data protection for individuals in the UK. So organizations will have to start thinking about processing and handling their data separately for the UK citizens and EU citizens.
And it is complicated because, as you say, with many of the events being international in nature, for example, a conference could be organised in one country, could be delivered in the UK, and you could have delegates attending from all over the world.
That's where the fun starts, unfortunately. So that is the case even now, but going forward, you really need to think about the data and the flow of data across borders. Okay, very commonly, a corporate in the UK may use an agency with whom they exchange data, and that agency may use commonly a DMC, say a DMC in Greece, with whom they need to exchange personal data. And the DMC, of course, may use multiple suppliers in Greece with whom they need to exchange personal data. So you really need to understand what data is being exchanged and shared with whom and for what purpose, and then respect the two legislations. One is the UK GDPR and the other is the EU GDPR.
Now, if there's a deal as part of Brexit, will all of these problems go away?
Okay, so it won't go away, but be deferred. So even as I speak, even if we listen to the news, you know, obviously we all listen to the news every day, and even yesterday, it just feels that we're getting closer to a no-deal Brexit. Who knows exactly what's going to happen? It's only 4 months away. If there is a deal, basically whatever changes are going to be are going to happen will actually be deferred, because then the UK will go into the transition period, and during the transition period, nothing will change. However, if there's no deal, then the changes, which are sort of like alluded to some of the changes, but there are more, will come into effect from the 31st of October, if that is the date that the UK leaves the EU.
It sounds to be quite a complex minefield. So what steps, if any, should businesses be taking now in the run-up to our departure, we think, from Europe?
Sorry, so many businesses would have gone through a data audit as they came up to GDPR in May last year. In effect, they need to go through a similar exercise, but this time thinking, and one of the key words is awareness, be aware of EU data and UK data, yeah, and the fact that the exchange of the data across borders. All right. So if they have EU data and it's being exchanged with another EU country or a third country, it may have one implication, and the same is true for the UK data. So they just need to be aware of the data they hold, who they share it with, where in the world those people are, even the technology platforms they're using as well, and be mindful of that as further guidance comes further down the line. Everything I've told you so far is based on guidance which is available mostly from the ICO website currently. But as we get closer to Brexit, further guidance will come down the line.
Well, thanks very much indeed for your time, Arvi.
Yes, you're welcome.
And if you want to find out more, Arvi has written a really useful illustrated article on the subject of GDPR, Brexit and events, the links for which you can find below. Thanks very much indeed for watching the Meetings Club channel.